He sounds like he's running. And then, no, I need the cops. That sentence is the hinge in the story of Brandon Lawson. It is the last clear thing we have from his own voice before he vanishes. You're listening to Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Tonight, we go back to a dark West Texas night, August 9, 2013. One man stranded on the shoulder of U.S. Highway 277. A short, chaotic 911 call, a truck out of gas, and then silence. The question that drives this episode: how does a 26-year-old father of four disappear yards from a highway and stay missing for nearly a decade? What could have happened between that 51-second 911 call and the moment people realized he wasn't coming back? We'll walk the timeline, parse the call, and, importantly, look at how limited assumptions and rural resource constraints may have shaped the response that night. Before we get into evidence and theory, a word about tone. This episode is somber. We'll talk about addiction and legal trouble, but we will center Brandon as a person, a son, a father, someone with friends and children who waited for answers. I'm joined by Dr. Caleb Rios. Caleb, welcome back to Still Unanswered.
Thanks, Mara. It's good to be here. Tough story.
It is. Caleb, you've worked in 911 centers, and you study rural search protocol. For listeners who haven't met you, give us a sentence on what lens you're bringing tonight.
Sure. I'm a forensic criminologist, and I used to supervise 911 operations in a mixed rural environment. Tonight, I want to help separate what the call likely indicates from what it might not, and to talk about the practical limits responders face on nights like this: dark roads, private property, and assumptions about suspects or warrants. Okay?
Okay. Let's start with Brandon the man. Who was he? Brandon Mason Lawson was 26 years old. Born in Fort Worth, he lived in San Angelo, Texas, with Ladessa Lofton, the mother of 3 of his children, and together they had 4 kids between them. He worked in oil field jobs, long, hard shifts. Friends and family describe him as funny, gregarious. He could work a room the way some people tell stories. But his life had stressors. Documented struggles with methamphetamine, and an outstanding felony warrant from earlier drug charges. All of that matters for the night we're about to retrace.
And Mara, that background, his job, the long hours, the drug history, the warrant, those aren't incidental. They shape behavior and how other people react to him. If someone has an outstanding warrant, they might avoid police contact. If they're using meth, they might have paranoid or erratic behavior. Both things likely colored the choices Brandon made and the assumptions others made that night.
Right. Let's walk through the timeline step by step. August 8th, 2013. Brandon comes home to San Angelo late that evening, around 10:45 or 11 p.m. He and Ladessa have a heated argument. She later told interviewers she believed he'd been using again. At about 11:30 p.m., he calls his father in Crowley and says he's coming up to stay the night. Crowley's about 3 hours away. His father tries to stop him from driving, but Brandon insists. He leaves at 11:53 or so in a silver Ford F-150, heading north on US 277 toward Abilene and then on toward Crowley. Sometime around midnight to 12:30 a.m., he calls his younger brother Kyle and says the truck ran out of gas near Bronte. This stretch of 277 is rural, very dark at night, minimal shoulders, mesquite, cactus, rough ground. Kyle and his girlfriend Audrey decide to go bring gas.
So from a response perspective, at the time Brandon called Kyle, there's still a family-centered attempt to help. Brother brings gas, girlfriend present. That's a hopeful sign. But the presence of an outstanding warrant, and later reports that Brandon admitted to meth use, introduce competing priorities for the people at the scene. Protect the person from arrest, or call for full emergency response. That tension matters.
It absolutely does. We get to the 911 call at around 12:50 a.m. The call is 51 seconds long. Dispatch audio, unedited, reveals a breathless, panicked man trying to describe a confusing situation. He says he's in the middle of a field. He tells the operator his truck ran out of gas. Then, this part haunts listeners. He says something about other people and being chased. Importantly, when the operator asks if he needs an ambulance, he replies, and I'll paraphrase, "No, I need the cops." That choice of words changed how a lot of people later interpreted the scene.
Yeah, that line, "I need the cops," is a real indicator of perceived threat. If someone is breathing heavy and says, "I need the cops," rather than "I need an ambulance," they're framing the event as a safety threat, not medical. As a result, the dispatcher and responding deputy need to be thinking threat containment and suspect presence. But remember, when calls are this brief and garbled, dispatchers only have so much to go on. They're balancing scarce resources and safety for responders.
Let's go through what happened when responders and family arrived at the truck. Around 1:10 a.m., Kyle and Audrey arrive, in addition to a Coke County deputy who had responded to an earlier report of the truck. They find the silver F-150 parked on the shoulder. It's out of gas. There's no visible damage. Brandon is nowhere in or near the vehicle. His keys and phone are not in the truck. Presumably, they were with him. The deputy and Kyle scan the area, call out, drive the road. At one point, someone reports seeing a figure moving away from the truck, but it's a shadowy sighting and never clearly confirmed as Brandon.
And here we hit a critical decision point. The deputy, based on what he knows, an abandoned truck, an absent driver, and the family suggesting Brandon may be avoiding arrest, makes an operational judgment. Should they deploy canines, request air support, or assume the subject is voluntarily hiding? In many rural jurisdictions, the answer often depends on perceived immediate danger and available manpower. If law enforcement thinks a person is hiding due to a warrant, urgency may be tempered. That decision can, in tragic cases, cost crucial response time.
Kyle later said he downplayed the seriousness of the situation when speaking to the deputy because he was worried about Brandon being arrested. That's an understandable human response, protecting your brother, but it may have affected how urgent the search felt to the deputy. At around 1:18 a.m., there are additional garbled calls from Brandon to Kyle or Audrey that drop out. Kyle leaves a gas can in the truck, and, this detail is important, he does not have money to fill it at that moment. His plan is to return in the morning or once he can get cash. By 5 a.m., the truck is still there. By about 8 a.m., it's towed.
From an investigator's point of view, those early hours are the window where outcomes are most likely to be altered. If Brandon were injured and still alive, or if he were disoriented and close by, a search in the first 2 to 4 hours dramatically increases his chances of being found. Once daylight comes, and especially after property is towed or disturbed, search dynamics change. That early assumption that he was voluntarily avoiding police likely reduced the immediate, concentrated search effort. Once daylight comes, and especially after property is towed or disturbed, search dynamics change. That early assumption that he was voluntarily avoiding police likely reduced the immediate, concentrated search effort.
Right. Now, the 911 call itself is the piece of audio investigators and the internet have chewed over for years. Different listeners have produced competing transcriptions. Some hear, "I ran into them." Others hear, "They pushed some guys over." Some insist there are multiple people, a car, a chase. Part of the problem is poor audio quality, wind, distance, possible intoxication. People tend to hear what they expect in ambiguous audio. Caleb, walk us through what 911 supervisors look for in a call like this and where ambiguity creates risk.
Sure. Dispatchers are trained to extract three things as quickly as possible: the caller's location, the nature of the threat, and whether there are weapons or injuries. When the caller is breathless, slurred, or paranoid, that becomes difficult. In Brandon's call, you have fragments: middle of a field, truck ran out of gas, chasing, or ran into them, all suggest threat. But you also have uncertainty about who them are. Is it other motorists? Is it a group? Is it an internal drug-induced fear? In such cases, best practice is to err on the side of safety. Treat it as a potential threat, request backup, and keep communication open. But in small rural centers, backup might be hours away. So the dispatcher might prioritize getting an officer at the scene to assess. That's what happened here.
Do you think the dispatcher mishandled the call?
I'm careful about second-guessing without hearing the original clean audio and knowing the exact dispatcher training and workload that night. What I can say is this: the call contained enough indicators of a safety threat that it should have triggered a heightened response and documentation of specific search strategies. Canine units, checks of nearby structures, and attempts to locate Brandon's phone via cell provider pinging. Whether those resources were available or requested is another matter. But the call alone, even with ambiguity, could have supported a more urgent, methodical search.
And this is where the warrant factor becomes corrosive. Officials later said they treated Brandon's absence as voluntary, partly because of his outstanding felony warrant. Family and advocates argue that emphasis on the warrant deprioritized a full search. Caleb, how common is it for a warrant to change the tone of a response?
More common than people realize. When you have a subject with an outstanding warrant, the immediate assumption, especially if the scene lacks signs of struggle, is that person might be avoiding arrest. That can lead to a watch-and-wait approach and a focus on contact rather than rescue. Ideally, warrant status should be recorded but not allowed to eclipse safety. If someone calls 911 and indicates threat, their warrant should trigger caution. Don't approach alone, but not reduce the search priority. The needle should tip towards safety first.
That's the policy side. Let's return to the human timeline. After the initial night, the truck remained. The family set up a Facebook page, Help Find Brandon Lawson, and over the years, it became a hub for volunteers, theories, and updates. Podcasters helped sustain attention, but for nearly 9 years, there was no confirmed trace until February 2022.
I want to pause on that. The role of online communities was pivotal. They kept the story alive in ways traditional media did not. They also helped coordinate volunteer searches and outreach. That had both positive and negative consequences. Positive in terms of resources mobilized, negative in terms of rumor and unhelpful speculation. But in this case, volunteer energy directly contributed to bringing new eyes to previously inaccessible private property that ended up mattering.
Yes. In February 2022, volunteers organized by advocates and several podcasts obtained permission to search private land near where the truck was left. They found clothing consistent with what Brandon had been wearing: a yellow shirt, camo shorts, white Nike shoes, and then the Texas Rangers were called. Human remains were found nearby. Over the following months, it took time to extract DNA because the remains were partial and degraded. The family and the community waded through those months, And on December 25, 2024, LaDessa posted that DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Brandon Lawson.
Which closes the missing person chapter in the administrative sense. He is identified. But it doesn't close the story of what happened that night. The cause and manner of death remain publicly unclear in many reports. When remains are skeletal and degraded, determining cause of death is often impossible. So you can have identification without a narrative of events.
Exactly. That distinction is one of the things that still feels cruel. The family finally has certainty that their loved one is deceased, but the larger, haunting how is unresolved. Did he die of exposure after wandering? Was he injured in a fall? Was there an altercation that left little forensic trace? Was there foul play? Those questions are at the core of what remains still unanswered.
And there are three plausible theories that tend to be discussed. 1. Drug-induced paranoia leading to accidental death. Brandon, high on meth, perceives threat, runs into rough terrain at night, becomes disoriented or injured, and succumbs to exposure or injury. 2. Foul play. An actual confrontation or ambush with other people, followed by harm and concealment. 3. A hybrid. He fled out of fear of both perceived pursuers and law enforcement, got lost or injured, and then died. Each theory has supporting points, and each is hamstrung by lack of definitive physical evidence.
Let's take those one at a time. First, drug-induced paranoia and accidental death. Supporters of this theory point to family statements that Brandon used meth that night or that he had relapsed. Methamphetamine can produce intense paranoia and erratic, high-risk decisions, like running off the road into brush. The 911 call's breathless, fragmented speech fits with someone in panic. The terrain, a tangle of brush, cactus, uneven ground, makes it easy to injure yourself or become immobilized in the dark. If you're alone and in panic, you might not last long.
Right. From a medical and behavioral standpoint, that scenario is entirely plausible. People under stimulants can become convinced they're being chased when no one is around. They might act impulsively, climb fences, slip into ravines, get cut on barbed wire. At night, a simple sprain or hypovolemia from lacerations can escalate into fatal outcomes if the person is alone and unable to call for continued help. The lack of clear defensive wounds or evidence of trauma might support this, although degraded remains limit our ability to know.
Second, foul play. The 911 call references them and the guys chasing me, which some interpret as evidence of other people actively pursuing him. There are various subvariants: an accidental collision that turned confrontational, a deliberate ambush, or an encounter with people engaging in other criminal activity. Supporters of this view point out that Brandon said, "I need the cops," and that he spoke of a car and multiple people. If he were attacked or transported or hidden, that might explain why early searchers didn't find him.
Foul play is possible, and it's hard to rule out with degraded remains. But we also have to weigh the counter-evidence. Brandon's remains and the clothing were found relatively near the truck and not far removed from the last known area. If someone had wanted to remove a body from the scene, transporting it that short distance in rural country increases risk. Also, if there had been a violent homicide scene, you'd often expect transfer evidence or witness reports, though not always. After nearly a decade, no credible tip has led to a named suspect, which complicates the foul play argument but does not disprove it.
And the third theory, the hybrid, tries to reconcile both sides. Brandon might have been high and paranoid, saw or misinterpreted a vehicle or people, fled because he feared both those people and arrest from officers arriving, and then got into terrain that caused injury or disorientation. That seems to line up with both his mental state and the physical evidence, clothes found in brush, remains nearby, no clear signs of a protracted struggle.
That hybrid is, to me, the most defensible theory in the absence of clear forensic indicators. It accounts for human behavior, fear of arrest, paranoia due to stimulants, and flight into the environment. It also fits with the reality of rural responses: limited lighting, limited personnel, and prolonged gaps before property could be searched with permission. It's frustrating because it feels unsatisfying. The truth feels like a mix of tragic human failures and the limits of systems designed for different types of emergencies.
Let's widen the lens to system failures, search procedures, and rural limitations. You mentioned earlier that rural dispatchers often lack canine units or helicopters. There's also the issue of private land searches across multiple rural properties can't happen without owner permission. The Lawson family and advocates later argued that key private parcels weren't thoroughly searched in 2013. That inability to search property early on may have been decisive.
Absolutely. In many rural cases, immediate access to private property is the choke point. A deputy won't necessarily trespass without probable cause, and obtaining warrants or owner permission takes time. If the family and volunteers don't have access, you end up with a narrow area searched and large swaths left untouched. When private land is searched later, after years of weathering and animal activity, physical evidence that might once have been obvious, clothing, bloodstains, track marks, may be gone or degraded. That window is critical.
Another systemic question this case raises is, should an outstanding warrant ever reduce the urgency of a search? Family members say they were terrified that telling law enforcement about the warrant would cause less urgency. They worried they were protecting Brandon from arrest and simultaneously complicit in minimizing the search. Caleb, what should family do in that position?
That's a hard, heartbreaking question. My practical answer is, always be candid about both vulnerabilities and immediate risks. Tell dispatch and officers the person has a warrant, but stress that he is calling and reporting threats or dangers. Emphasize your fear for his safety. If the dispatcher knows both the legal context and the immediate peril, they can prioritize safety while exercising caution. In practice, families often lie, understandably, to avoid arrest outcomes. That impulse can have tragic consequences, as we've seen in cases like Brandon's.
We also have to talk about how podcasts and internet communities got involved. For nearly a decade, this case stayed active in the public imagination because Facebook pages, podcasters, and volunteers kept asking questions. In 2022, that energy helped secure permission to search previously closed private land, ultimately leading to the discovery of clothing and remains. That's a powerful example of public attention doing real investigative work.
Yes, I want to be clear. While online speculation can harm investigations through false leads and harassment, in this instance, the community pressure led to more boots on the ground, more willingness from landowners to allow searches, and more volunteers combing the area. That's a demonstrable positive outcome. But it came with the cost of years of rumor and accusation directed at the family. It's a double-edged sword.
Let's bring the emotional thread back in. The family's experience over those years is central. Children missing their father at birthdays and holidays, a partner who keeps the page alive for hope, a brother carrying the weight of decisions he made in the middle of the night. Those human elements are what make this so painful. When remains were finally confirmed, the family had closure in one sense, but an even deeper set of questions about what precisely happened. It's a bitter kind of closure.
And from a professional point of view, when identification comes that late, it's both relief and forensic frustration. Relief because the family no longer has to live with limbo. Frustration because the delayed discovery means evidence that could have told us how he died is gone. It's an indictment of gaps in rural response capacity and search protocols, even if no willful negligence occurred. Systems could be improved to respond differently in similar cases.
That's a good lead into the what ifs, the questions this case leaves us with. For listeners, here are the ones I keep returning to. Who, if anyone, was chasing Brandon? What did he mean by "I ran into them"? How far did he go, and why that direction? Could he have been alive for some time after the last call? Hours? Maybe. Or did he die relatively quickly? And, systemically, how should agencies weigh warrants against immediate safety in a 911 context?
I would add, how can rural jurisdictions better coordinate with private landowners to allow rapid searches? Should dispatchers have more training to treat short, confused calls as higher priority? And should there be protocols to request resources from neighboring counties more proactively? And finally, how do we harness citizen energy responsibly? Encouraging volunteer searches without letting rumor take over and without compromising evidence.
Those are the policy questions that matter beyond Brandon's tragic story. For the Lawson family, there's also the personal aftermath, grief, questions, and, if they want it, justice. Forensic identification gives them a grave marker in time and place, but it doesn't provide who, if anyone, should be held responsible. As hosts of a show that lives in the uncertain spaces between evidence and speculation, we have to be careful. We can propose likely scenarios and highlight failures, but we cannot fill the gaps with unfounded accusations.
Exactly. Responsible reconstruction is different than sensational speculation. We can and should interrogate system failures and inconsistencies in the timeline. We can examine the 911 call with professional ears, but absent hard forensic indicators, naming suspects or leaping to conspiracies does no one any favors, especially families.
Before we close, Caleb, are there concrete changes you'd recommend to prevent tragedies like this in future rural 911 calls?
Yes, a few practical things. 1. Train dispatchers to treat brief, confused calls that reference being chased as high priority, requesting a uniformed response with backup and thorough scene canvassing. 2. Create expedited legal pathways to allow emergency searches of private property when a missing person call contains indicators of potential danger. Right now, waits for warrants or owner permission can cost days. 3. Foster regional mutual aid agreements, air units, canines, or trackers so nearby counties can be rapidly requested. 4. Include warrant presence as information, not a decision point. A disclaimer to guide officer safety, but not to reduce the urgency of a welfare search. Implementing even a few of these could change outcomes.
Those seem like sensible, concrete steps. Caleb, I want to ask one more thing. When people listen to that 51-second call and the transcriptions drift into competing narratives, is there a danger in crowdsourcing interpretation of audio like that?
There is. Human brains look for patterns. We fill gaps with what we expect. Once a theory takes hold online, confirmation bias entrenches it. Audio of poor quality is especially susceptible to that. So I always urge caution. Use professional audio enhancement where possible. Look at corroborating facts and avoid constructing entire narratives from a single ambiguous snippet. In Brandon's case, the audio was a starting point, not a conclusion.
Wise words. We'll wrap with where things stand today. Brandon's remains were found in 2022 after volunteer and advocate searches located clothing consistent with what he wore. The Texas Rangers and other agencies were involved in the recovery. DNA confirmed the identity in late 2024. The official cause and manner of death are, as far as public records show, not definitively reported in a way that explains the events of that night. The family has the sorrow of confirmation, but many of the central questions remain unresolved.
And for investigators, this case is a reminder. Missing person responses need a bias toward urgency when a caller indicates immediate danger, even if the caller also has complicating legal issues. For families and communities, it's a lesson in persistence, how public attention can lead to searches that agencies either could not or did not immediately execute. But we should also be mindful of compassion. Speculation can wound already grieving people.
Brandon Lawson was 26 when he left his house for what he thought would be a long drive to his father's. He was a father himself. The night he disappeared involved fights, calls, a note of panic in his voice, and an unanswered plea for help. Nearly a decade later, volunteers and advocates helped return his remains to his family. What we still don't have is the clear story of those hours between the 911 call and his death. That absence, that unresolved how, is why this belongs on Still Unanswered. If you want to read more, our episode notes list source materials, news accounts, podcast deep dives, and public records. We'll also link, for anyone listening, to guidelines on how to support families of missing persons without posting speculation online. Caleb, thank you for your time and steady analysis tonight.
Thank you, Mara. It's important we talk about these cases carefully.
And to our listeners, if you have information that you believe could help, please pass it through proper law enforcement channels. Avoid throwing uncorroborated claims on social media. This episode is about a life cut short and a family that deserves facts, not fiction. I'm Mara Ellison. This has been Still Unanswered. We'll be back next week with another case. Until then, listen carefully, stay kind, and remember, behind every unanswered question is someone who loved the person at the center of it. One final note. If the subject of missing persons triggers painful feelings for you, please consider pausing and reaching out to someone you trust. There are resources in the show notes. Good night.